Good afternoon and welcome to BIFA's webinar on the ETS maritime expansion. It's great to see so many of you online. Thank you for all the members who have come along today, who have taken time out of your busy schedule to listen to this topic. I hope you find it interesting, useful and ultimately commercially practical. Hopefully this gives you something to go back to your organisations and implement. I am pleased to be joined today by Jocelyn Hanson from Searoutes. Searoutes is a technology company that specialises in calculating and optimising freight transport distances and carbon emissions. And Jocelyn has a wealth of experience in all areas of the supply chain, and she has spent many years working with freight forwarders. So it's great to have Jocelyn here. I'll just give you an idea of the running order today. So firstly, I will briefly introduce what the ETS is, and then I'll hand over to Jocelyn, who will give us a presentation discussing the new regulatory requirements and how it will affect our members. And then finally, I will host a Q&A session. So we're going to move to the first slide of the presentation, which I'll be presenting, and then we'll move on to Jocelyn. So what is the ETS? The ETS is the Emissions Trading Scheme, UK Emissions Trading Scheme, and it's a cap and trade carbon pricing policy. It's used as an economic market-based solution to deal with the negative externality of carbon, which is not included in price, and then given an internal price to carbon. What it does is put a cap on greenhouse gas emissions on certain sectors, and this is divided into UK allowances or UKAS, which is equivalent to 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. Operators every year have to surrender the number of UCASs which are equivalent to their carbon emissions. These UCASs can be bought at auction or at a secondary market. So for example, if an operator didn't use all of its allowances, it could sell it to an operator who needed that allowance to claim the greenhouse gas emissions. The ETS currently covers heavy industry, power and aviation, and now it is moving into domestic maritime, which is the whole purpose of the webinar today. And that begins, as far as we know, unless something happened in the last few hours, whilst we've been rehearsing, it's going to happen on the 1st of July, so fairly soon. So now what we're going to do is we are going to begin to transition to Jocelyn of Searoutes.
Wonderful, thank you, Jamie. So maybe I will just start by introducing myself to those of you who don't know me. So as Jamie mentioned, I've actually spent the last 25 years working in the logistics industry at different freight tech companies. So I've worked at a company called Intra, which very much dealt with the operational side. I worked at Zanetta, who many of you know from potentially the commercial side about freight rate benchmarking. And then I joined Searoutes about 4.5 years ago to look far more at the sustainability side. It's given me a wealth of sort of experience in terms of actually understanding how to ship something fast, cheap, and now even green. And so I want to focus very much today on giving you some information about the ETS and the UK ETS specifically, things to consider, things to think about as this comes into effect on the 1st of July. So I'm going to go through a few slides. I'll give you a brief introduction. I'm going to explain how the ETS works in a little bit more detail. I'm going to both explain how the EU ETS works, because that has now been in effect for 2.5 years. So we have a lot of experience already on the continent here about how it actually works and what's going into effect and some of the things that we have seen. I will then also explain how the ETS works for the UK specifically as of the 1st of July. And then I'm going to explain a little bit more about things that you may want to think about as this goes into effect, some of the loopholes that are also still there, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So yes, please, feel free to put the questions in the Q&A as we go through. So yeah, just to explain a little bit about this, and I'm sure as you are all, freight forwarders out there, you already know that, your customers are now really having to think about compliance in a much greater scale than they have done before. Even though some sustainability measures are, have been postponed, it's not any sort of surprise to anybody that your customers will start asking for more and more. 5-10 years ago, it was just give me a CO2 number that I can slap on a report so that I know that I'm compliant. But now it's becoming far more detailed. It's now going into the ETS. It's now hitting their wallets. So they're far more interested in actually how that's going to impact them than just doing a report. But it is something that companies are going to have more and more requirements and demands from their service providers and from the carriers to make sure not just that they are complying, but that it is not hitting them too hard from a financial perspective as well. So let me explain a little bit how the EU ETS works to start with. For those of you, I'm sure many of you also have potentially customers who also ship over to the EU as well. So let me explain a little bit about how the EU ETS works. The EU ETS works by basically looking at every ship that enters the EU. And it measures the carbon emissions that have been emitted by every single ship, and it's only ships that are actually over 5,000 tons. So it's not every ship that goes into the EU, but it basically looks at the last port of call before it hits Europe to the first port of call in Europe. The CO2 for that particular part of the journey is calculated, only 50% is the bit that you need to consider for the carriers. And then each port of call within Europe is actually considered 100%. So the reason why I'm saying this, and the reason why it's something to think about, is because of the fact that the UK is not part of the EU. So what you may have noticed is some of the carriers have coined on to the fact that there's a little loophole in the EU ETS in the fact that if they call the UK as the last port of call before Europe, then their carbon contribution is far less for that particular part of the EU ETS. So it's something to bear in mind as you're looking at carriers and the different services that they are putting into effect and how services change, etc. I've put a few scenarios here so that you can really look at this in a little bit more detail to understand exactly how it could impact you. Because at the end of the day, the actual ETS program is really geared towards the carriers. And the carriers are really looking at it from a ship perspective. Now, of course, they have to do it from their ships that they're operating, but they're having to then pass that charge on to their customers. That's you and your customers, to make sure that they can afford to pay the EU allowances. Now they just, have come up with an average. So they'll look at what the average is across a trade lane, and they've come up with prices that they publish on their website. So it's public information, how much they charge. And it's something that you can have a look at, and it's very different depending on which services and what ports of call are in place. So really understanding the services and what ships are operating on what services and what ports of call are there is something to really think about, and it's something that we at Searoutes, we have all of that data. So we have all of the data of the ships in terms of the AIS information, which is from satellite and terrestrial sources that tells us the speed and the distances of every single ship on the planet. But we also know which ships are operating on what rotations of what services. So the schedule information, the pro forma information, to really understand, okay, which services are doing what and what ships are on what services. That allows us to really look into these specific, exact, really accurate carbon emission calculations that help us to really understand exactly what it would mean for a given container on a given ship. At the moment, the EU ETS price is about €80 per tonne of CO2. This is something that, of course, like a lot of other things, including freight rates, goes up and down dramatically at the moment, considering all of the geopolitical issues that we're having. And so that price, of course, will change, and it is likely to go up. But looking at a standard, container from Shanghai to Marseille, for example, you'd be looking at about €30 per TEU. It can change depending on what kinds of services there are. So if I look to a different port pair, and this time I'm looking at Tanjung Pelepas to Hamburg. And if I look at this, there's actually different services that you can use with different carriers. but most carriers are still charging the same. And if you actually look at the carrier websites, and it's something to pay attention to, some carriers who are even operating on the same alliance are charging very different EU ETS charges for the exact same service. It's also interesting to look at whether or not they call the UK, because as you can see there on the bottom right hand side, if you look at a service like the AE5 or the FE4, they call a UK port before calling Europe, which means the EU ETS charge should be significantly lower than what they actually publish on their websites. But of course, the carriers, they don't want to get too detailed into the details of the different services, etc. So they just charge an average for the trade lane. But if you actually look at what's truly happening, there's actually different services and there's different levels of what the EU ETS should be by container. So if you have the data available to you, you could actually start looking at this and making sure that you're doing your best to, limit your exposure to the EU ETS charges. So depending on the service, there can be a very different charge that's included. As I mentioned, of course, the carriers, to back them up a little bit here, not that we try and defend them too much, but to back the carriers up a little bit, of course, they are the operators, and you may be shipping with and booking with Maersk, but it may go on a Hapag vessel. And of course, they don't know the Hapag vessel in terms of its engines, in terms of its speeds and other things, and its actual fuel consumption to know what the CO2 is for a container on a Hapag vessel. So, of course, the carriers have to charge an average because they don't know what the vessels are of other people in either a vessel sharing agreement or within a specific alliance. But even with their own services, they can actually see that there should be a difference, but they're trying to make things a little bit simpler for themselves and reduce the complexity of understanding, okay, well, if we actually looked at it down to the container level and the individual ships, maybe we should have different pricing for this. But it's something that carriers are doing. They are publishing those, and that is something that you can easily get from every carrier website to understand what the EU ETS charges are for given trade lanes. So that's how the EU ETS works at the moment. It's been put into place. It went into place on January the 1st in 2024. At that time, we actually had a very phased approach. And basically, in 2024, they were only charged 40% of the actual of what they needed to do. Last year, that went up to 70%. But as of 2026, that then went up to 100%. So we are now fully in the EU ETS world. But the UK ETS, of course, comes into effect on the 1st of July. There is no phasing this in. It's going to come and it's going to impact 100% from the get-go. However, there are some things to bear in mind. So this is a UK ETS. It is primarily for the carriers who are then passing the cost on to you. However, the UK ETS is really only looking at domestic voyages in the UK. So the loophole of some of the big shipping lines who are still calling the UK but then going over to the EU, that will still be there because most of the services that we see where they're calling London Gateway, Felixstowe, Southampton, what have you, they are only calling one UK port. If they happen to be calling multiple UK ports, then there would be a domestic voyage within the UK and it would also be susceptible to the UK ETS. But most of the major shipping lines that have a UK port of call before Europe, they are going to probably continue with that at the moment because that loophole is still in place. As I mentioned before, it doesn't cover every type of vessel, but it is going to cover container vessels, of course. So it is worth looking at what you are, which vessels it might apply to that you are shipping on. The carriers themselves actually report in something called the MRV report in terms of their fuel consumption and their emissions, and that is also something that can help us verify, that the emissions that they are submitting are accurate. At the moment, it looks like that the UK's, as Jamie mentioned at the very beginning, the price at the moment is around £49 per tonne of CO2. That is expected to rise over time. Now, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. If I did, I would be able to, definitely look into the future and be able to see when and how much. But I mean, I don't, and especially with container shipping, you never know what happens. There's been far too many black swan events in the last 5 to 10 years for me to give any kind of indication, but it is expected to rise, not just because of the way the world works and what's going on, but also because of the fact that they want to try and push carriers and push the maritime industry into more decarbonisation. So they want to really push people to do what they can to have greener ships, to ship more cleanly. And so the price will go up to incentivize people to do what they can to decarbonize. So it's only the start. As it says there, it starts on the 1st of July. But, over the next couple of years, you're really going to see, the carriers and yourselves and your customers starting to look to what they can do to actually, reduce their risk of paying too much UK ETS, but also understanding how can they actually ship green. It should be a part of your entire service offering of, okay, I can ship it fast, I can ship it cheap, I can also ship it green, and here are the options how we can do that so that you don't have to think too much about what the UK ETS might impact you on. So looking at specific ports in the UK, the one thing that I will say is that there are still some services, mainly feeder services, that are going around the UK that you may want to think about. So especially if you're shipping, for example, between Tilbury and Grangemouth, there's a lot of other ones that are going around the UK. These will be susceptible to the UK ETS. So understanding how you are shipping around the UK is really important right now. It may not seem like a big charge to you right now, but it will also depend on the volume that you are shipping in that direction, and that's only going to get greater over time. So it's something to bear in mind. On the EU ETS side, just to give you all a little bit of an idea, most freight forwarders now in Europe are saying that it's anywhere between 5 and 12% of their entire freight spend that they have to spend. Most of their customers are looking at 5 to 12% of their freight spend is actually on EU ETS charges alone. So it might look like a small thing, but it's only going to get bigger, and people are really going to start to see an impact in the future. So although it may be something you don't want to look at right now, it's going to get worse. So you might as well look at it in the beginning and understand the impact so that you can make sure that you are managing it correctly. Just to summarize the difference between the EU ETS and the UK ETS, I mean, I've mentioned a number of these things at the moment. There are prices out there, public indexes that you can use to actually see what the price is. And there is no linking at the moment between the UK ETS and the EU ETS. So the two will remain separate. So you may find that when you look at the rates that you're being given by the carriers, there could be both EU and UK ETS charges on your freight rates, etc., on top of your freight rates. Now I know that some people will probably be sitting there going, oh, it doesn't matter, I told the carrier to shove it in and I'll just measure the carriers all the same in terms of whatever the overall price is of the freight rate, etc. And a lot of carriers are starting to do that. But a lot of customers are also saying, no, I want it to be separate. And there's a good reason to keep it separate, is that then you can manage it. And then you can really understand, okay, am I paying too much? Am I paying too little? Am I paying a fair price for what it is? Or am I just paying the average, even though I'm doing what I can to ship on the greenest ships, to ship on the shortest, cleanest journeys, etc. If you are have a sustainability strategy and you want to try and do that, it's worth keeping them separate to really sort of prove to both yourselves as a corporate organization, but also to your customers, that you know what's going on and that you know how it's all happening, and that you are managing this and you're making sure that they're not impacted, more than they should be. One thing to bear in mind, and I've put this in there, even though I'm a big fan of sustainability, and even though I would love to say yes, everybody should be shipping green, because hey, I mean, it's 38 degrees in Copenhagen today. That isn't something that we are used to in Copenhagen. So climate change is definitely not going in the right direction at the moment. So everything that we can do, of course, is definitely what we want to. But hey, I also know that you're freight forwarders. I also know that you're service providers. And at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to the cost of things. Now, what you will find is that the carriers, when they offer green fuel programs, which a number of them do have, they will eliminate the EU ETS and the UK ETS. So they say if you buy into our green fuel program, then there will be no surcharges on top. A number of them do that. The thing to bear in mind is also, well, what does that mean to both yourselves and your customers? But what does that also mean compared to just paying the ETS, as it is? If we look at today, it's actually cheaper to just pay the ETS than it is to buy into the green fuel programs. Of course, it's not the right thing to think about in terms of course, we want to be going towards, reducing the physical emissions, but there will be a tipping point. And there will be a tipping point probably quicker than everybody realizes. As green fuels become more prevalent, as more people buy into it, we will definitely see that, the price of green fuels will be going down and the price of the ETS is going up. And the question is, do you want to turn around in a couple of years' time and find out actually what the decision you made to just pay the ETS is actually costing you more than the green fuel programs? So it's something to bear in mind at the moment, but it's also something to bear in mind in the future. And especially for your customers who are really looking to decarbonize and prove that they are doing what they can to reduce their carbon footprint, it's still worth looking into some of the carriers' green fuel programs. So I just put a little summary here of some of the things that I personally would recommend to you as the UK ETS goes into effect on July the 1st. I think one of the key things to first of all do before you do anything is, what is your exposure? Look at what you are shipping UK domestic between different UK ports, and really understand what the volumes are and what that might potentially mean to you as the UK ETS goes into effect. The carriers, then second of all, I would also look at the carriers' websites. It is totally published, or the carriers do publish it, to really understand, okay, what's that actually going to mean? What's the financial impact that's going to happen to me on the 1st of UK based on what I'm shipping in, within the UK, and really understand what that's going to mean. I think you may even want to, of course, understand and make sure that your customers and the contracts that you have with your customers, as well as with your carriers, make sure that everybody knows who's going to bear the cost of it. Now, as I mentioned before, the carriers are going to pass that cost on to you. I'm sure you as freight forwarders are also going to pass that on to your customers as well. The question is also to make sure that, you don't provide too much of a buffer, because your customers will start to see that, freight forwarders will differ in terms of what they're actually passing on as a cost. So, but it's worth making sure that everything is in place so everybody knows that there is something coming and your customers are going to have to pay this UK ETS when it comes into effect. It's worth also making sure that you do this now, of course, rather than that they suddenly see a yet another surcharge. I mean, let's face it. I mean, I know the carriers are good at coming up with surcharges every so often, especially in times of war and other things like that, and fuel prices. But it's worth making sure that your customers are informed so that they also really, understand what's going on, and that there'll be this new surcharge as of 1st of July. I think one of the key things is also for those customers that you have that also ship to the EU, it would be good to map out the difference and understand and make sure that they really understand the difference between what the UK ETS charges and what the EU ETS charges, so that they don't think that you're double dipping and trying to get, two charges from, the same shipment. It could be, really good to explain to them what the difference is between the two. And then I think it's really, really important. This is just the start, but it's really important to see how it's gone. From my experience, having seen a lot of freight forwarders in the EU back in 2024 going, it's not very much, to today, some of the big guys, I mean, they're paying millions in EU ETS charges now and kind of going, damn, I should have paid attention a few years ago, because this is actually something that's really impacting me now. And it's something that can, be something that you should talk to your carriers about. Make sure that you take it into those quarterly business reviews. It should be part of their performance reviews as well, to make sure that you're not being overcharged for that. The one thing I will say, and I is that this is something that Searoutes, it's not a sales pitch, but it is something to just bear in mind. This is something that Searoutes has a product for. There are other products out there, but this is something that we do have a product for, to really understand, because we are able to calculate the CO2 calculations so accurately. We can understand, okay, based on a customer's volume and their allocations to the different lanes and the different port pairs, we can understand what they will be charged by the carriers versus if they actually stick to certain services or certain ships, etc., then actually we can show what they should have been charged if we looked at the actual shipments that they actually did. And a lot of customers, both shippers and forwarders, are taking this in to their carrier conversations to have a conversation of, are you sure that you're not providing a little bit too much of a buffer? It's also worth noting right now, you may find that your customers also come to you with this and say, are you not charging us too much in UK ETS or EU ETS? And making sure that you have the data available to make sure that you understand the calculations, how it's done, and making sure that everybody is aware of, of what those charges are, is a good conversation to have. It can also be something that you can use within your actual sort of ocean freight tender negotiations as well. Because if you're looking at the overall cost of what you are spending on ocean freight, then it's definitely something that you should bring up with your ocean carriers. I've come to the end of the presentation itself. Just to really summarize, I hope that that has been interesting information for you to understand the ETS scheme, to understand what the impacts might be to you, and to understand exactly how it works. It's going to be something that a lot of people are going to be talking about in the coming months, but I'm sure that a number of you probably have some questions, and I would be more than happy to take some questions now, so that you can get even further familiar with the UK ETS and anything else that you'd like to know about that.
Thank you so much for that. It was really interesting. As I said, we'll move into a time of Q&A now. So part of what you said about you briefing your customers and talking to your customers about these charges. Now, obviously, as a BIFA member, they're protected under certain clauses of the STC, like clause 20, to pass on charges. But it's good to have that conversation with customers. But when it comes to the price of the ETS, when you're given that quote, is that the same? Is the ETS charge the same when it sails, or is there a discrepancy? When is the timing?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that I would say is that the carriers very much look at the ETS surcharge as something that is on a ship level, or potentially even a service level, or even a trade lane level. So, and they always include a buffer, because they will be carrying containers from other carriers, and some of their containers will be on other ships. So they have to pay attention to the fact that they, as a carrier, are having to pay the EUA for the ship. irrespective of which containers are on it, they have to pay for the ship. So they are basically taking EU ETS surcharge from their customers to make sure that they can pay the EU allowance. So it doesn't really go from a carrier's perspective. They only really care about the ship and making sure that they get enough money to pay the EU allowance for that ship. But as a customer, you care about your container. So I think it's two perspectives, and I think you should look at your container from when it's been shipped and what ship it has been actually shipped on, because that is what you should be contributing to the world.
Okay, that's really, really good. Thank you. I've got a question on here from Jack. If there was a shipment that stopped off at a UK port, then an EU port, then back to a UK port, would that create a loophole in UK ETS to reduce the domestic
Technically,
sorry,
yes. Technically,
okay.
yes is the answer. I would say yes, because the UK ETS is UK port to UK port. It also includes if you go to the same port, but it without any, I mean, it's more for sort of offshore and, you know, other types of ships. But if you, so long as it's a UK port to a UK port, it's included in UK ETS. But if it went UK port, like Le Havre, and then it went back to the UK, then it would not be part of the UK ETS.
Okay, that's
It'd be interesting
always
to
interesting
see
to get a loophole.
Yeah.
Still got time for Q&A, guys, so put them in the Q&A section. I have one more. So I don't know if this was, I can't remember if this was mentioned, but did you mention the emissions at berth and at port, even for international voyages?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually in there, and it is actually part of the new standard. So there is something called the GLEC framework, which those of you who are into sustainability reporting within logistics will know that the GLEC framework is something that a lot of people follow. But there is also something called, there's a new ISO standard called the 14083, and that standard actually includes the what we call the hubs. So it can be certain things, including terminals, etc. So it is part of the CO2 calculations. So that is something that, yeah, you should be looking at that as well.
Okay.
It's part of the calculation that is made when you look at a shipment.
Yeah, no, I just wonder if that factored in also too. You said that a number of ships are stopping at the UK first to avoid the 100% EU charges, whether that would maybe affect it in some way. But I guess it's still less even with the emissions at berth.
I think I would also say it's a smaller part of the calculation, a much smaller part of the calculation, considering, you know, rather than the journey is the big part, right? That's the big part of the calculations. So it is a smaller part.
Thank you. I've got a question from Martin. How are the price of the allowances determined? Does the government just issue a fixed price to the carriers?
Yeah, so I know basically I know that for the EU ETS, I mean, there is something called EMBER, EMBER, which is a website where you can actually go and look at the EU ETS price and look at its fluctuation on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So it's something that is put out there. So that I'm sure it's the same with the UK ETS in terms of the fact that it should be something that is readily publicly available. There should be an index out there that tells you what the price of carbon is. And that is something that, you know, you can follow so that you can understand how quickly it's going up and down. I mean, when we started the EU ETS back in 2024, it was around 80. It did go up to 100. It's gone down to 70. It's now back up at 80. So it has gone up. It has gone down. It does fluctuate. And that is so it is something to pay attention to as we move, you know, into the years to come.
Thank you. We've got another question here from John. Will ETS ever be rolled out to road rail movements in the future?
Yes. I can categorically say yes, because I know that it's already going to happen. So there is already plans in, I mean, I won't say exactly when and where, but I know that there's already plans to do it for road and rail specifically. I know that the road one is coming very soon. I think it's not until 2027 or 8. I can't remember which one. But yes, other modes of transport will absolutely pay attention, to the ETS scheme and start following it as well.
Yeah, and I guess off the back of that, is there almost a danger of modal shift, which is actually counterintuitive in the sense that rather than doing a domestic maritime voyage, somebody might choose to use a domestic road freight voyage because there's no road ETS?
I mean, yes, but the ETS for maritime is not that big that, actually the cost potentially and the CO2 specifically is so much more for road than it is for ocean that it would not be worth doing that. Rail may be a different situation because rail is also quite low in CO2. I mean, it's better than road, but it also depends on what your road fleet is. I mean, if you've got electric road fleets, then who knows whether the ETS will actually apply to that. So I think it may apply to road in the future, but it depends on whether we're talking about, diesel or whether we're talking about electric vehicles. And I would assume, don't quote me, I'm not a policymaker, but I would assume that when the ETS comes to road, I would assume that electric vehicles and other things like that would actually be exempt or have some kind of reduction to it. It shouldn't be applied to everything.
Okay, great. I don't see any more questions on the chat, so I will say a big thank you to you, Jocelyn.
You're very welcome.
I thought it was brilliant. I know that your contact details are on the slides, which will be distributed to the members who attended. And we'll also, as I said, we'll upload this webinar to BIFA TV in the next coming week. I will also plug our conference, which is on the 23rd and 24th of September in Warwick University. And we actually have Jocelyn speaking there as well. So if you enjoyed her today, then come along. We also have Harry Redknapp as our after-dinner speaker. So tickets are available now, and there should be a QR code coming up on the screen. And finally, I just want to say thank you all for attending today. I think it was really interesting, and we'll keep having these conversations about the ETS.